Oh, perfect. But I'm gonna give everyone 4 or 5 more minutes.
Okay.
You're not hearing me. I'm not hearing you.
We hear you. We do hear you, Tom.
Thanks.
Perfect.
Tom, I got a question for you while we're waiting. Are you getting hit pretty hard with the cicadas in northern Kentucky?
I'm not in northern Kentucky.
Oh, okay.
I'm in Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill, and in my neighborhood, there's not a single cicada.
Okay, it had you listed as NKU here as well as the National Labor College, so I didn't realize that.
Well, I retired from NKU.
Okay.
And the National Labor College retired itself. So
Isn't it actually pretty bad in Virginia and Maryland? That's what I've been hearing.
oh, it's bad in everywhere else except where I happen to live. I happen to love cicadas, and I had to travel to another part of the city in order to bring my grandkids into the cicada century because they simply were not in Capitol Hill. I don't know why.
Wow.
Maybe they know about the politicians.
Fair point. Now, I actually didn't get this email. I have no idea what happened. It's so interesting.
Maybe it got filtered out somehow.
Yeah, must have. So I was starting to get nervous. I was like, why is this other session still ongoing? And we need more time, right? So that's good.
Well, Zoom anxiety is a genuine medical condition. So, you know, we mastered email, we mastered PowerPoint, we mastered all kinds of things. So we had to master Zoom, and
Yeah,
most of the time it works, but when it doesn't, it's very anxious making.
yeah, for sure.
Thank you for organizing this, by the way.
Oh my gosh, no problem. It was fun to read all the slides and to see the recordings. The recordings were, you know, just in case, by the way.
I couldn't.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I'm live.
I think we just had problems of people just having technical difficulties. So these recordings were just in case people just couldn't hear each other or couldn't sign on and so on and so forth.
Yep. A friend of mine said that he, whenever he uses Safari, he has more trouble than
Oh, wow.
than other servers. I don't know.
It's been a while since I used Safari, so yeah, that's
I'm on Safari all the time and no problem. So maybe there's some interaction with something else he's doing.
Yep.
Well, let me give maybe 1 more minute and then we can get started. This is actually, this format for the poster section has been created by Andrew Weaver at UIUC. Angie, you probably know Andrew. He was trying to think of these creative ways to do a poster session online. And so, you know, it looks like it worked out last year pretty well. So All right, why don't we get it started? And then, so again, so welcome everyone. I am going to put on a recording from Elizabeth Arnold first, and Chester Hanvey from Berkeley Research Group. Okay. So let me try to share my screen. All right, so does everyone see the, oops, now I'm not seeing, sorry, give me 1 second. I don't see everyone's faces anymore.
If you're working on a single screen, you may not be able to see everyone while you're sharing screen.
I see. So, okay, that's fine for now. Okay, why don't I play this now? And then... Try this again. Okay.
Don't forget to hit record. Yes, we are recording. Never mind.
Yep, we are recording. Okay.
Hello, I am presenting the results of our research regarding hourly remote employees' compliance with timekeeping requirements. Compliance with timekeeping requirements is significant because in order to be paid for all the time worked, it needs to be recorded accurately. So we found that company policy communication, which is the company's effective communication of policies to employees, supervisor communication ability, which is individual supervisors' ability to effectively communicate with their employees, and self-discipline were all related to various aspects of timekeeping and compliance. In contrast, we found that system usability, which is the extent to which employees can effectively use the system, was not related to compliance. Thank you very much.
All right. Did everyone hear that?
Yeah, I heard.
Okay, great. So, you know, they obviously couldn't make it today, but please feel free to email them if you have any questions or comments. I did have one comment about their work. I actually find it really interesting that a lot of the individuals actually said that they don't include computer boot up time or the time they spend on work emails in their reported work hours. So I just wonder to what extent this type of task not being reported, it's, you know, whether that, you know, whether that there has been some sort of change due to the remote work on that, right? And I think it could be an interesting question to explore further in the future, because I just think it's interesting to think about these differential consequences of remote work. If others have any other comments on this paper or research, please feel free to email them again. Okay, so let me then move on to Eung Kim. So we'll hear from him, who is a PhD student at Yonsei University in South Korea. Let's see if I can find this slide. All right. Yep, so feel free to take it from here. Eung, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, hello. Yes, my name is Eung Kim. I will start present my poster. the idea of my poster is started from double-edged sword effect of employee voice. As you know, many researchers are still in debate of employee voice effect on organization. My viewpoint was employees' voice in regular meetings may have positive effects on both organization and employees. The reason was that employees may face problems from both outside and also inside of the workplace. Moreover, many people and employees are focusing on temporary effect of employee, but not the persistency of employee voice. So I thought that there might be better results for workplace which has regular meetings for hearing thoughts from employees. To find this effect, I used simple analysis using SPSS. The measurements were not exactly same as mentioned in the slide because the measurement is a little bit different with the public data. The results support that work to family conflict and workplace inequity were lower, which had regular meetings for employee voice. Moreover, perceived supervised support was higher than no meetings. So the research supports that employees in regular meetings reduce negative effect and also increased positive effect for organizations and employees. So the conclusion was that consistent regular meetings are critical parts of employee voice and gave many benefits for organization and employees. So that's all for my poster. Thank you for hearing my presentation.
Thank you, Eung Kim. Does anyone have questions or comments?
I have one comment. Thanks for your presentation. I noticed during COVID, the regular and consistent meetings haven't really been occurring. And we seem to be relying on a lot of informal communication to get answers. And I think people are missing the workplace as a result, but decision-making and all kinds of things is very different during this COVID period.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting comment. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, with COVID, it's just very hard to have these regular meetings. And it's actually also related to my comment and sort of a question. So it looks like your data comes from this cross-sectional survey of employees, right? So, I wonder if you sort of had multiple years of data, whether you could actually capture the change in voice during regular meetings. So, going back to Stephen's comments, right? In 1 year, you had more voice in regular meetings, and the second year you just don't even have meetings, right? Or you just don't have voice in regular meetings. So I think it would be really interesting to capture some of these variations. And even to think about like sort of the types of voice during these meetings. Is it about like, just talking about your personal problems because you also talked about work-family conflict, or is it actually about meaningful voice where it ultimately helps make decisions at work, right? So I think these are different types of voice that you may be able to capture depending on your survey data. I know that some of these surveys are just not, they are just insufficient in answering some questions, but I wonder if that's possible. And I also actually think that it's really important to think about the persistency in voice, which is what you were sort of arguing. And I think it's, one of the more important sort of ways to think about perceptions of employee voice in general, which is talked a lot about in the literature. So anyways, I kind of gave you a comment and sort of a question. Do you know, can you explain to us a little bit more about the survey and whether you can sort of look at the variation?
Yes, thank you for your comments from Tom and Hezin. Yes, I agree with you that if the data was measured in panel, then the results may be fruitful and more give a contribution for the organization. But I try to find whether the measurement is a panel data or not. But I found that the public data only measured the cross-sectional, the only one time about the employee voice in this data. So that was that should be improved for my next research. So I will look forward to waiting if this public data measured same same question in the next panel data. So I'm waiting for about the same measurement. So if they measure the same things, then I can follow. Yes.
I think you froze there a little bit, but yes, that'll be really exciting if you are able to sort of get this sort of a panel data set or even the second cross-sectional data on this. All right, thank you so much. Why don't I now move on to Stephen Havlovic from Laurentian University and Charles Smith from Otterbein College. So okay. I'm just going to try to do this a little bit better. Okay, let me just share this entire screen. And then this is it, right? Let's see. Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Charles Smith and I revisited the hypotheses from my 1979 master's thesis, where I examined the impact of collective bargaining, geographical location, and age on the wages of professional nurses. We used data from 1970 to 1993 from the National Longitudinal Surveys, better known as NLS database. The NLS survey was administered 14 times over this 23-year period. Using the Young Women's NLS cohort, we had a pooled time series sample of 954 nurses. We used Cochrane-Orcott regression procedures to correct for first-order serial correlation, and there was no issues with multicollinearity. 189 nurse respondents, or 19% of the sample, were covered by a collective agreement. Only 18 of the nurse respondents, or 2% of the sample, were covered by a collective agreement in the southern United States. Collective bargaining in the rural South was essentially non-existent, with only one nurse respondent having collective agreement coverage. The regression results show collective bargaining having a positive impact on the wages of professional nurses, working in the South having a negative effect on nursing wages. The interaction of collective bargaining in the South also had a reduced impact on nurses' wages. Wages in rural locations were lower than in urban locations, and age had a positive effect on nurses' wages. 10% of the variance in the nurses' pay was explained by the regression analysis.
All right, thank you, Stephen. That was really interesting. I love that this comes out of your master's thesis work a long time ago, and you sort of came back to it. Is this, just really quick question, is this a Canadian data set?
No, this is a US data set administered by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's just the Census Department goes out and collects this data.
Mm-hmm.
And I should note that it's an uneven cross-section time series. So it was administered 14 times over this period, but not everyone participated every time. So we had, you know, some missing individuals, but there was also the missing years because it wasn't issued each year. And then the original master's thesis was from the data from 1970 to 74. That was what was available when I did my thesis. And I should note that before I corrected for the serial correlation, inflation had a huge impact. When I ran it before standardizing to the 1983 wage rate, over 80% of the variance was explained by the equation. But when I put out that trend line, you know, for time with inflation, only 10% of the variance was explained by these independent variables.
I see. Thank you. So you probably couldn't do, because of such a small number of union membership coverage in the South, you probably couldn't do any interactions or anything.
Well, I could do the interaction with collective bargaining in the South, but I couldn't do a three-way with collective bargaining rural in the South or collective bargaining rural because there was only that one person, one nurse that had collective bargaining in the South coverage. But that was an important finding in itself. And these right to work states that in the rural locations, there's just no collective bargaining, you know, occurring.
Right, right. So that in and of itself, I mean, being in the South and being in the rural area also probably just directly means that there is not really an access to collective bargaining. So that just lowers the wages for these individuals. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? All right, if not, we'll move on to Tom Zaniolo's work. He's the Emeritus Professor at Northern Kentucky University and National Labor College. Let's see if I have slide. Is this the right one?
Yes,
Zaniolo?
that's
Okay.
badly typeset, but that's my fault.
Okay, let me see if I can increase the text size. Okay, there you go.
Oh, that's a little better. Thank you.
All right.
The self-quarantine, the self-isolation and quarantine that began last March led me to make the quixotic decision to watch an epidemic film or an episode from an epidemic TV series every day until the quarantine was over. So 15 months later, I've compiled a database of almost 200 films and TV series, and that's available on my blog. If you Google WordPress, my name and epidemic, you'll get the list. What I discovered was that my suppositions about epidemics would be what the second line of the slide, that it's a film genre that explores medical, social, political impact of pathogens. And this seemed to be common sense. But I soon realized that those were what we call pathogenic epidemics. Disease vectors are biological, viruses, bacteria, fungi, etc. But it turned out that if you look at a different set of epidemics, what I call non-biological and non-pathogenic, it reveals a lot about political and labor situations. These non-pathogenic epidemics include inorganic materials, chemicals, toxic waste, or immaterial forces, radioactivity, heat, smog. And then I give an example here of some of the best films that cover these non-pathogenic epidemics. I'm not going to read the list to you. You can see it there, but I recommend all of them, especially if you've been following the opioid addiction epidemic. Crime of the Century, which has just been released, is an outstanding film. The precariat, which I defined as the vast numbers of unemployed and underpaid and temporary workers of the world, even in the best of times, are not ideally situated to survive economically or even literally in epidemics or pandemics. Epidemic cinema as a film genre explores the social and political impact of biological pathogens. That's what we're used to. But my study turned to the effect of additional vectors such as lead poisoning, severe heat waves, opioid addiction, and so forth. These non-pathogenic vectors have similar catastrophic and socio-economic impact as traditional pathogen-based epidemics. It turned out, not surprisingly, that working people, migrant laborers, hospital workers, teachers, cleaners, deliverers, security guards, fire and rescue teams, restaurant and hotel workers, and retail workers bear the much greater burden and danger in all epidemics, pathogenic or non-pathogenic. They especially are impacted by the non-pathogenic epidemics disproportionately, in part because of where they work, where they live, and the nature of their work. I am currently writing a book based on this. I have to stop watching films and do more writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I'm actually amazed by the fact that you started watching these films during the pandemic, because some of these films were the ones that I actually avoided during the pandemic because I felt too depressed watching these. I think it's, interesting to think about the notion of precariats that are presented in these films. And, I see an extreme relevance, especially today as we face the COVID-19 pandemic. We've sort of seen this rise in gig economy and temp workers working at sort of high risk work environments during COVID-19, right? So, if you don't mind, do you mind sort of talking to us a little bit about how you may be able to sort of draw the connection between some of these films and some of the concepts presented there and the frameworks that you're putting together and precariats during COVID-19?
Well, as a matter of fact, when I began this this project, there were really only 2 films about COVID-19, and this was back in March of last year. One of them is by Naomi Klein, whose work probably most of you know, her anti-capitalist work, and the other was a new Canadian film. There are now at least 19 films available about COVID-19, and there's also on that my website, my blog has a list of those 19 films and what they do. I think what the filmmakers, especially the somewhat more politically conscious filmmakers, have discovered as they pursue this is that the COVID-19 epidemic is like most epidemics. Let me get my cheat sheet on that, which seems to be temporarily missing. That they have, that there are causative agents. They originate in one or many places. There's no immediate cure or remedy. The brunt of the negative effects fall not only obviously on the afflicted, but also on health workers and people living in the poor and working class community. As the filmmakers discovered, that government at all levels of authority will lie about the epidemic and its severity. And of course, it'll end someday, but its mirror image will return. And that is one of the saddest things, is that a lot of the lessons of previous epidemics and pandemics were, generally speaking, ignored, especially in the United States culture. I can't speak for other cultures as well.
All right, thank you, Tom. I look forward to reading your book. Should be really interesting. And, I look forward to also just watching films on sort of how these sort of precariats are faring during COVID-19. I think there's been growing number of research on that topic. So I think it'd be interesting to see that also in films. It's also relevant because I also, like showing films to my students in class. So, this could be a good also class material. Okay, I think now we'll move on to Maggie Liu. She is a, thank you so much, Tom.
Can I ask
Oh,
a
sorry.
really quick,
Oh, yes, of course.
can I ask Tom a really quick question?
Sure.
That 1991 film, what's the location of Chemical Valley?
West Virginia. What city? I don't have the city. I don't have the small city, but it's West Virginia.
I know where it is, and I've driven through there. I know where there's chemical operations. Well, I just wasn't sure which location. So thanks.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Union Carbide too, by the way. And I included poisonous smog because that was also a Union Carbide factory. And Chemical Valley is noted for a quotation from one of the locals. This was about the relationship to Bhopal, which comes up in these films all the time, the destruction and horrible massacre of all the workers in Bhopal, India.
Thank you. All right, so we'll move on. Sorry, we'll just look for the right one. There we go. Okay, so Maggie Liu is a visiting assistant professor in the School of Labor and Employment Relations at UIUC. And so you can take it from here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hejin. Thank you. Could everyone hear me clearly? It seems my network is not that stable. Great. So China's public sector has historically provided good jobs with superior job security, stable income, and generous employee benefits. However, structural segmentation also exists in the public sector. This study compares permanent workers in two types of non-permanent workers that are non-permanent worker with and without protection of employment contract in the public sector on their wages and benefits levels. So the first question we want to answer here is, are there significant wage and benefits disparities between the good and bad jobs in the Chinese public sector? So with regression method and also the inverse probability weighted regression adjustments, we found significant wage and benefits gap between permanent and both of the two types of non-permanent jobs in the public sector. And the second question here is, are the favorable characteristics of the good jobs, such as the higher benefits levels, could be extended to the bad jobs if we compare the bad jobs in the public sector with the jobs in the private sector? So to answer this question, we combine the sample of public sector non-permanent workers and the sample of private sector workers together. Compared with the private sector worker, non-permanent workers in the public sector with protection of labor contract could have better benefits, but lower income level. But non-permanent public sector workers with no protection from labor contracts have both lower income and lower benefits than their private sector counterparts. That means the favorable characteristics of good jobs in the public sector could only be extended to the bad jobs if the workers sign formal labor contract with the employer. And to find out the reason why people are still willing to join the bad jobs in the public sector, we further divided the private sector workers into formal and informal groups that are good jobs and bad jobs in the private sector. So regression results show that there is no significant wage gap between the bad jobs in both of the two sectors. But bad jobs in the public sector provide higher benefits level, and this higher benefits could be the reason why people are still willing to join the bad jobs or even the worst jobs in the public sector. And that is all about the study. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Meiji. Anyone have comments or questions?
Thank you, Haejin.
What is the China Labor Force Dynamic Survey? What's its where does it come from?
So this is a this data set is a panel data, social survey data from one university of China. It's called Sun Yat-sen University, and it starts in 2010. And every 2 years, it will have a national survey. And we use data from their third wave, that is 2016. Because this is the first time they started to ask the question whether the workers in the public sector are permanent workers. And this is a very sensitive variable. That's why in other social surveys, they didn't ask this question. And we found this question really valuable and interesting. It's the first time we could identify the real permanent workers in the public sector.
Stephen?
This was very interesting. I've been to China many times, mostly recruiting students and working on articulation agreements, but I never see a union presence. So I was curious as to exactly in the public sector in China, what's meant by labor contract.
Yeah. So this labor contract is not collective contract. It's the individual level labor contract, because since 2008, we have a new labor contract law in China. That is, if we are workers in the private sector, all of the workers need to sign a labor contract with the employer. And that shows that we are formal employees of this company or of this workplace. But the public sector still have their own employment system where the labor contract actually doesn't work the same as the private sector.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I actually find this third table really interesting in the sense that you basically found that public non-permanent, no labor, even if you are in the public sector, then even if you're a non-permanent worker and don't have any labor contract, you are still more likely to have greater benefits than private sector informal workers, right? So are were you also able to compare with private sector permanent workers? And did you see any sort of differences? Okay.
Yes, actually in the to answer the third question, we include the private sector formal employees that are the workers in the public sector who hold the good jobs. Actually, we could still make it more in detail, and we could try to identify whether they are the real permanent workers in the private sector. That is, we have a variable that shows the length of the labor contract, whether they are permanent workers or the length is only 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. Yes.
I see.
Thank
Okay,
you
so if I
very
see
much for the question, Haejin. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so it looks like if you look at the magnitude between public non-permanent with labor contract and private sector formal employee, it's greater for the public non-permanent with labor contract. So even if they don't, even if they're not permanent, they still prefer public. I mean, it's still better to have a public sector job. It sounds like.
Yes. So although their income level is lower than the private sector formal employee. So this could be a compensating relation.
Right. And do you actually, so this is just their income and benefits that you measure, right? Do you know if what the perceptions of the
yes, income and benefits.
What they prefer?
So could you repeat the question, Hejun? I didn't hear you clearly. just
No,
now.
I was just wondering if you had any idea as to what the workers' perceptions were as to what they prefer generally. You know, is it just the case that, is there research about how, you know,
this is a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I just wonder if given the results.
Yes. Yeah, actually, we have a variable asking the workers. So if we just do not think about your current job, so what is your ideal job, in which sector, and in what kind of workplace? And but I didn't start to do research about that variable, but it's very interesting to dig more about people's ideas and preference. But actually for me, we have some data from graduates from several major universities in China, and young people still find jobs in the public sector very attractive, and many tens of thousands of young graduates, they took part in the government employee examination every year, and also apply for jobs in the state-owned enterprises. So also in Chinese, we call the jobs in the public sector the iron rice bowl, to show that, which is, so I think for many people, good jobs in the public sector is still their first choice.
I see. So that would be really fascinating for you to be able to sort of say that using data, because here you find that like you don't really see the positive effect in terms of wages, but you see these, you know, positive effects for the benefits. And so, you know, I think that could tell you a little bit also about, you know, generally, you know, what the workers' preferences are when they're looking at jobs. You know, if you find that these workers prefer public sector jobs, then, you know, that means they probably care a lot about benefit. So, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Hejun.
All right. Okay, so we'll now move on to Seung-Hoon Hong's research. Let me just, oops, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay. All right, so this is the slide. All right, so Seung-Hoon Hong is a PhD student at Rutgers University. And so Seung-Hoon, just please take it from here.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. This presentation is based on some parts of my master thesis, and the purpose of this study was to understand what prompts the graduate student employees, aka GSEs, one type of vulnerable workers, to initiate complaint behavior ranging from filing their grievance to talking with their supervisors, and what barriers prevent workers from exposing the complaints. So this study is composed of the two kinds of analysis. The first one is the regression analysis using the secondary data collected by Rogers et al.'s paper. It is a little bit old data. It is collected in around 10 years ago, but I want to provide some basic result here. So this data was obtained from the GSEs at 8 public universities, and final sample size were 516. So first, I will explain how I measured complaint behavior. So each GSEs were asked to answer whether they experienced the work-related problem in 9 cases. Then they were asked to which behavior they engaged in. If respondents checked any answer except for doing nothing, this study regarded such case as those they engaged in complaint behavior. Then this variable was calculated by dividing the number of cases that GSEs engaged in complaint behavior by the number of their actual work problem experienced. So according to the result, the only positive relationship with the advisor had a significant effect when controlling for all other independent variables. So when Jess had a relationship with advisor, they were likely to show their complaint. But if not, they were likely to keep silent. And it indicates the importance of the relationship with the advisor for Jess's complaint behavior. So next, I performed the interview with 9 Jesses to find how they actually how they actually feel the necessity of the complaint behavior and how they engage it. So overall, most work problems were related to the relationship with advisor or department. It is similar to the result in the statistical analysis. And they showed complaints informally or kept silent when they faced problem. So in many cases, they were afraid of the worsening relationship with their advisor, and those power dynamics could be worse for the younger or inexperienced student. And also during the interview, I also heard their opinion about the labor unions. So they said, though many Jesses showed a favorable attitude on the graduate labor union, and also agreed on the necessity of the university-wide action, they were not sure whether their individual issues can be connected or discussed with the collective ones led by the labor union. So in other words, it is still difficult for them to expose their individual issues because they were not sure about some confidentiality and about the labor unions' active attitude on their individual issues. So it is the result in my study. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Zheng. Anyone has comments or questions?
Well, I'm just fascinated by the variety of the of your categories and how well that how thoroughly it seems like you've covered this this issue. I'm very impressed with that.
Oh, thank you.
Yep, no, it's fascinating work. I actually had some comments. Well, I mean, actually one question first. I wonder if you found any sort of variations depending on the types of complaints or like demographic factors like race or gender in your data set. So I think that for the types of complaints, you had to do interviews to get to that. So you couldn't, there was nothing relevant to that in the survey, I would imagine. Is that?
There was a 4 type of their behavior. So such as the asking a faculty member for help, asking a university office for help, asking the union for help, and the other choice. But unfortunately, many students answered other. So I couldn't find especially why they engaged in which behavior they engaged in their problem experience. So that's why I added the interview to find especially which behavior they engaged and how the much variety in there is in their complaint behavior.
And did you find any variations by gender or race? Or was that also not
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I may need to. When actually I didn't include the analysis about the work problem experience. Actually, the study begins from their work problem experience. So which factor or which factor affects their problem experience, and then I added the analysis using this complaint behavior variable. I consider the gender and race in the work problem experience case, but I didn't include it in when I performed the analysis about the complaint behavior. Maybe I can add, and I can find whether the gender and race was the critical factor in the behavior.
I see. Thank you. I was just curious. You don't have to include it. I think it's, you know, if you find a variation, I think it's something really interesting, something that might be worth exploring further. I also did have a quick comment about your interviews. I think, you know, if you go back to some literature on voice, there is actually a lot about sort of these categories of voice. So, you know, the literature talks about sort of direct and indirect voice, as well as sort of individual and collective voice, and how that might actually affect these kinds of voice behaviors. And so, you know, you may be able to sort of map these interviews into some of these categories so that you strengthen your theoretical argument a little bit more as to, you know, what leads to some of these complaints and variations in complaints. So I encourage you to sort of get that literature.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so I think, well, thank you so much. Any other questions? All right, and that was actually really, really interesting. So let's move on to the last presentation. Lukombo, thanks for waiting. You are the last person. Let's see. Try to pull up the slides.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm here.
All right, there you go. So take it from here, Lukombo.
So how many minutes do I have?
You have about 2 or 3 minutes. You can actually take a little bit more. We do have time. So.
Thank you very much. So the title of this research is Chinese Trade Shock and Employer Concentration. So I would like to start by explaining the employer concentration, which is the portion of the control that certain employers have over employee in a certain area or certain industry. So what is happening is that recent literature has been seeing a kind of increase in employee concentration over time in the US, but also over region. This is particularly true when we look at the rural area or suburban areas. We can exclude areas like Los Angeles, areas like New York, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. But when we look at other US region, we see a lot more employer concentration, which is bad because it means that we have a high productivity, but employers are paying much less compared to what employees are really producing. So what Chinese trade shock has to do with the swift rise of import penetration for China to US, more specifically the imports that are coming from China to the US, starting more intensively in 1991. So what is the linkage between the two of them? The problem here, the central problem is that the literature has been seeing growth in terms of productivity, but when we look at the wage, we see that the wage in the US has not been growing that much. So the question here in terms of this research, is, does Chinese trade shock has to do with what we have been seeing in terms of growing employer concentration? Yes or not? So this research result found was able to answer that question. When we look at the U.S. labor market as a whole, yes, we see a negative impact of Chinese trade shock on employer concentration, which means that Chinese trade shock has been decreasing employer concentration. However, when we go to the sectoral one means that we look at those sectors that are more directly impacted by trade with China, or those that are not directly impacted by with China. in those sectors that are directly impacted by trade with China, the impact is also negative. However, when we look at those industry that are not directly impacted, that don't suffer direct impact from trade with China, the impact is positive, which means that the Chinese trade shock is really increasing employer concentration. So overall, those are the results. And I could go a little bit further in terms of detail if if it needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Combo. Does anyone have comments or questions? Yeah. So I think it was really interesting. I just wonder whether you are starting with an assumption that the local labor market's employer concentration reduces wages. Is that sort of the starting point?
I didn't look at the impact of employee concentration on wage, even though that has been looked at by other actors. What I did look at Chinese trade shock does impact employee concentration, but of course, if Chinese trade shock does impact employee concentration, and we know that employee concentration does impact wage, so we can say that, of course, indirectly, Chinese trade shock does impact wage, and it does impact employment. But that China and Chinese trade shock and wage, that work was done by Asimoglu, Otto, and David. So they did that. So this work basically is a kind of follow-up on their work, but it look more on at how Chinese trade shock impact employee concentration.
Right.
So.
No, thank you. That's what I was wondering, because I think there is a lot of research on how sort of the labor market concentration affects wages negatively, especially. But there are a lot of debates around it, and I think there are, the researchers are still trying to figure that out, right? And how is it happening? Why is the employer concentration happening? And I actually wonder if you did find Chinese trade shock to be affecting the employer concentration. What drives it? What is it about the trade shock that influences the employer concentration? Did you find anything, or do you have any ideas going forward?
So what was the question, the last question, sorry?
I would just wonder, what about Chinese trade shock that's impacting the employer concentration? I'm just, it's hard to sort of wrap my head around as to what might be the mechanisms, basically.
Yes.
Driving
Yes,
the
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I will go straight on in terms of the impact, sectoral impact, starting with the impact on those sectors that are directly impacted by trade with China. So in those sectors that are exposed directly to trade with China, the impact is negative. The mechanism is that is negative because those sectors are because we know that China is labor intensive, use a lot of labor, so they are able to produce much cheaper certain goods. So the import coming from China, some sector that are directly exposed in terms of trade with China, they are able to much quicker replace the production with the import from China. So said in other ways, in those sectors, employees are leaving, labor are leaving those sectors. Are leaving those sectors that are directly impacted by trade with China. So they are leaving those sectors, they are moving to other sectors. Let's say that manufacture. Some employees are leaving those sectors and are moving to other sectors that are not directly impacted in terms of trade with China. So in the opposite is true in those sectors that are not directly impacted in terms of trade with China. And in those industries, we have two divisions. We have sectors that are not directly impact with in terms of trade with China, but are tradable, and those sectors that are not directly impact in terms of trade with China, but are not tradable. Not tradable, let's say it's service, let's say like barber shop. So those sectors are not directly impact and also are also not tradable. In terms of tradable, the impact is positive, as I said, because again, it's the movement of work from one sector to another one. So it has to do most, in this first step, what I notice is that has to do with the movement in terms of labor market adjustment, kind of adjustment.
Right. So I think it sounds like you're making the assumption that employers are getting more concentrated. So when it comes to employer concentration, it either means that employers are, going through mergers, or there are more employers in that locality, right? How are you measuring employer concentration?
I'm measuring employer concentration in terms of HHI. Yes.
I see. So a number of employers. I mean, so yeah, I know that index, right? So
yes.
Relevant to the actual number of employers in that locality. I see.
Exactly.
So I think it might be really useful for you to try to empirically tease out what might actually be driving these relationships, not just the industries, but something about how trade shock just relates to the concentration, not just wages. I know you're kind of going to the wage route when in your explanations, but I think it'll be useful to see more direct linkage between the trade shock and concentration. Well, thank you so much. Oh, Stephen has a comment.
I just had a comment. I suppose if I read the whole paper, which we can't do on a poster session, maybe it would be answered, but the title and the implication is it's coming from China causing the shock. And I was thinking of the motives of outsourcing, largely because of cheaper labor going the other direction. So I think the causal direction of this, and it may be bi-directional, needs to get sorted out. Obviously, the trade treaties have opened things up, but I think of a presentation I saw some time ago involving charbroil, where Walmart was putting pressure on a U.S. manufacturer to lower their price by like 30%, the wholesale price. And the employees had to give up wages, and then they came back, Walmart came back like 2 years later and wanted another 25%. And the threat all along was, if you don't reduce the cost, we're going to manufacture in China. So charbroil shut down their whole operation in the US South, I believe it was Georgia, and moved it to China. But it has impact on the employees and the employer concentration in this, but it's not necessarily driven from the China to the US, but the US going to China. And the causality of this, I think, is complex. But hopefully in your paper, you can deal with some of these issues because it's a very complex issue.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. I would like to say that I agree with your points, and I'm already working. I agree that there might be a kind of bi-relationship, and I'm already working on the opposite relationship. I'm looking at how the employee concentration might be affecting the Chinese. I'm already working on that as well.
That sounds like a great idea. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for all your presentations. I think we had a really great variety of topics, and it was really interesting. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you all in person next year.
Thank you for refereeing.
Thank you, Hedja.
Thank you. It was great meeting you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Good job, Hai.
Bye-bye.
Bernadette. Thank you.
Good job. I stayed
Thank
on
you.
just in case there were any technical difficulties, but you handled it like a champ.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I did still struggle a little bit.
The poster session has a lot of moving parts, but this, I tell you, it was such a fun session last year, and same thing this year. Like, there's so many topics. It's
Right.
just like, it's so fast. There's so many conversations. That
Yeah.
I just really enjoy it.
Oh yes, for sure. And then I think I had to figure out how to like put up the recording for one of it.
Yeah.
I think you might have not seen the earlier one, but yeah, so it was just interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you
I
so
think
much.
last year, the one thing, I mean, for next year, if you want to just have a little talk right now, I think that Andrew stacked them all in one PowerPoint. So he just had to go like, next slide.
I see. That's
And they
probably a good idea. Yes.
automatically pulled up. I think that's honestly the only other thing that I would have suggested that you do differently, because then you're not screen share up and down.
Right. I was,
No,
like,
great
struggling
job.
with it, so. All right.
And I mean, how else do you do a virtual poster session?
I know that this was a really great idea, actually. So I think
Very
it went
good.
really well.
Well, I think that some people are going to hang out in here, because we said to start in breakout 1 for the happy hour. And we did not, because of that snafu in the 4 concurrent session, that 15-minute break that we forgot in the program, people could start popping in here any